quite often they are talking purely on valuation as opposed to really understand what is needed. So the investor is looking for a certain amount of equity. The founder is more worried about, let's say, dilution, not necessarily valuation. If both parties do understand this, I think there is a room for bridging the gap.
Hi Venkat, the topic for today's episode is navigating negotiations and closing deals. So, before we begin with the questions, would you like to share anything?
Hi, this is Venkat Raju. I am the CEO for the Turbostart group. For this topic, the relevance I bring to the table is I've been a serial entrepreneur. I raised multiple rounds of funding, so I've been on the other side. And over the last 15 years or so, I've been an investor, both as an angel as well as part of funds. And I've been on this side of the table. So do understand the dynamics between a founder and an investor, and look forward to this session.
As a former serial entrepreneur turned investor, you have navigated negotiations from both sides of the table. How did your experience as an entrepreneur inform your approach to establishing trust as an investor?
Establishing trust. Yes, trust is an absolutely critical thing. And when we talk about trust, we are not talking about integrity. I mean, I assume that's a given. Both parties are operating in good faith and they have the right integrity and so on. We are now talking about trust from a perspective where an investor looks at the entrepreneur, and does the investor trust if the founder really means what he is talking about? Is he as committed, and does he have the capability to execute on the vision that he is claiming? Similarly, as an entrepreneur, the person is looking at the investor saying, is this somebody who's committed to my company? Am I going to be one of multiple companies in the portfolio where they are willing to write me off when hard times hit, or are they going to watch my back? So this is like a dance that happens informally during the early stages of negotiation. It's very, very important that both parties are like kind of assessing each other, and good things happen when a mutual trust is established, and it is absolutely critical.
Were there specific strategies or insights you brought over from being an entrepreneur that proved instrumental in building rapport and trust with startup founders during negotiations?
It's very, very important to make sure both parties understand where they are coming from. The entrepreneur should explain as to why. They have many options to get money, but why this particular investor, and what is it that they are looking for specifically. Equally, on the other side, the investor has multiple startups to invest in, and why are they looking at it above and beyond their sectoral thesis as to why this particular startup. I think if these things are laid out on the table and the expectations are properly set, I think it serves as a good foundation for taking the conversation going forward.
What deal breakers or red flags do you find particularly concerning, and how do you advise founders to proactively address these issues?
Sure. There are several items that could be quote-unquote deal breakers. It is important to understand the red flags on both sides. Probably it's the single biggest area where there is a potential gap and could be a deal breaker comes down to valuation. So a founder has to understand where the investor is coming, especially in an early stage investment. They are coming in taking a high risk, and for that they are expecting certain reward in terms of upside. That means for the risk that they are taking, are they going to get sufficient equity so that like when the company scales up through multiple rounds of dilution, that they still hold some sufficient equity. So for them, the amount of equity that they have in the company is critical. Equally, on the investor has to understand the entrepreneur saying, okay, what is the primary driver for the entrepreneur here when the discussion is around valuation? And quite often they are talking purely on valuation as opposed to really understand what is needed. So the investor is looking for a certain amount of equity. The founder is more worried about, let's say, dilution, not necessarily valuation. If both parties do understand this, I think there is a room for bridging the gap, for example, saying, okay, perhaps if we can reduce the size of the round and still the company can execute well on its business plan, perhaps the gap can be reduced where the dilution consideration is taken care, the investor's expectation equity is taken care, and so on. And using this as an example, I think we can touch on other things on information rights and other kinds of rights, for example. It all comes down to the trust, which we talked about earlier. If the trust is there, then all the other things should follow through, including on difficult topics such as valuation.
Having undergone due diligence as an entrepreneur, what due diligence practices do you suggest for founders to prepare for investor scrutiny?
Right. So this is a question I get often from entrepreneurs. Okay, now that we had this conversation, assuming I am getting approval from you, from your investment committee, how soon can we close this and when will I get the money? And to a large extent, that's a function of how well the entrepreneur is prepared from a diligence perspective. Quite often, when we start the process and we have a lot of requirements, and then the founder is not quite prepared. Now we are talking about compliances, regulatory stuff, and a variety of other documentation required. And if the entrepreneurs are not quite ready, or they are just working on it after being asked, that's a challenge. So to help with the process right at the start, if we believe that the deal is likely to happen, we provide a checklist of the various documents required as part of the diligence. And I would rather that the entrepreneur proactively looks at that checklist and prepares. And regardless of the investor, these are sound business practices that you need to have, regulatory filings and compliance with various matters and so on and so forth. So if you're running a clean shop with good hygiene, I think you are well positioned for the diligence phase.
From the initial negotiation phase to deal closing, how should entrepreneurs ensure alignment of goals and expectations with investors?
Sure. It will help during this negotiation phase if people start looking a little ahead. I think post-investment, how is the future going to look? Because the interests are going to be aligned between the investors and the founders, for example. Together, we are going to embark on this journey in terms of business growth, next round of funding, customer acquisition, and so on. How are we going to partner? I think if both parties spend more time thinking about it during the negotiation phase, post the investment, for example, I think that's a very good method to visualize how they can work together. And if you are able to get that kind of thinking going, the alignment comes naturally, and that certainly also helps during the negotiation phase to close any gaps, if you will.
Entrepreneurs may encounter disagreements with investors during negotiations. Drawing from your experience, how have you navigated such situations, and what advice do you offer founders for handling disagreements effectively?
Right. In any tough negotiation, any business, disagreements are to be expected. Disagreements need not necessarily lead to some unpleasant activities or words said and so on. I think people should be mature enough to deal with it properly. I would rather bring up the disagreements or areas of contentions up front, talk openly about it, and I would rather do more in-person meetings. Ideally, over a coffee or something in a very informal settings. And I think going back to that alignment and trust and ability to work together, I think if people can focus more, keep the big picture in mind, see the areas of convergence, and then say, okay, we have 2 or 3 areas of disagreements, and if there is good faith on both sides, I think people can overcome such disagreements.
Considering that this is the last episode of our podcast series, what message do you have for startup founders looking for funding?
Sure. If I'm an entrepreneur, I'm looking for funding, I would approach it with the same kind of discipline how I would approach, let's say, a B2B sales. So that means it's not the number of leads or number of customers I'm going to chase, but how well qualified they are. That means, have I done the research? I would rather focus on, let's say, if I want to close a deal, instead of going after 100 VCs, for example, I would pick probably the top 20 that fit, their thesis fits my company, their priorities as expressed publicly, privately, and so on and so forth. And I would use that as a method to qualify and focus my time and energy. The other tip I would say is, yes, you want to go to a certain fund because of a certain thesis, they are active in your space, but funds comprise of multiple partners, for example, and each partner, he or she may have their own individual thesis that's a better fit. So I would go after such people and contact them in any which way and establish a relationship. Even before you are officially fundraising, if you are able to get into the radar and able to provide regular updates, showing progress, etc., when time comes, you should be able to reach out to them and close it. And so that's what I would say. Research and do the hard work, and good things will happen.